So thank you very much for having me. This is super exciting to be here. So this is not based on a paper, but on a recent book. I've been horribly unsuccessful in cutting this to time, so I will just sort of self-silence at 12 minutes here. But if you want more context or high theory, that's all in there. So today, though, what I'd like to talk about is sort of like the trajectory of television news, and as it becomes kind of an internet medium. And they've actually been at it for a long time, longer than a lot of other sorts of media. But they've also been slow, but it's taken quite a while for them to get where they are today. And so I'll talk about some of the different factors that make that a reality. We'll talk about sort of infrastructure, business model, consumer demand, professional norms. And like any good technology scholar, I realize that all these are related. But in the name of linearity, I'm going to try and bulldoze through these in as straightforward a pattern as I can. So we'll start with infrastructure. So in many ways, sort of the story of like television news online, or at least the video component of it, is the story of broadband penetration, which was much slower than many kind of analysts were predicting, and in some cases much slower than many companies were betting on. So a nice example of this is MSNBC, and this is sort of the main case study of the book. Basically, it was started in late 1995 as a joint venture between Microsoft and NBC. And it was sort of the poster child for Convergence. It was going to be this sort of multimedia news operation that was equal parts web and television. And so it's instructive to compare sort of what the vision of it was to what actually worked out. And to do that, we have to kind of go back. So I'm going to take you back to 1995. So Microsoft was enjoying sort of meteoric profits in the wake of its release of Windows 95, and to keep growing, they realized they were going to need to diversify, and expanding into media looked like an attractive proposition. So they started their own dial-up network, and this was at a time where dial-up networks, like closed dial-up networks like AOL and so forth, looked like they might compete with the internet. This is what they thought of it at the time. They obviously miscalculated pretty terribly. And so it turned out that they lost a really expensive bet on sort of what the future of online media was going to look like, and they wanted a partner to sort of help subsidize their retooling to sort of a web media model. Meanwhile, the assumption was that sort of the television and computers were going to converge. You remember Web TV, the thing that put your web browser on the television set? Microsoft bought that company, and they went shopping for media partners in the television business. And NBC ended up being the people who they partnered with. So in late 1995, Microsoft and NBC signed a deal to create MSNBC. That's Robert Wright, the president of NBC, and some other guy. And as part of that deal, Microsoft would actually pay to create this joint venture between the two companies, and Microsoft was going to pay $20 million a year for exclusive rights to all the television news content that MSNBC and NBC News would produce when it came to putting it online. And they signed a 99-year contract to pay, so $20 million a year for 99 years. You only do that if you're totally sold on the idea of convergence, that the internet is quickly going to become the way that people watch TV, and it does not. So basically, in 1996, sort of Christopher Harper wrote about the origins of MSNBC. Basically likened sort of delivering video online to pumping peanut butter through a straw, because broadband penetration was just about nil at that point. And for many people, the situation doesn't get better for a long time. So within a few years, by 2002 here, the CEO of Microsoft is saying that if we were starting MSNBC now, as good an operation as it is, I don't think we would have started it. That's a nice sort of Rumsfeld-style quote, but basically the idea is we're having real big regrets here. Broadband penetration is not happening like we thought it would. People are not buying into this. So in the meantime, during this period, if you're a television news executive and you're wondering about how to get ahead of the curve, because you see what's happening to newspapers and so forth with the internet, and you're thinking, how can we put some of our content online? Where are people most likely to have broadband access? And the answer is at the office. And so you see a number of early experiments with short newscasts over the web that are happening around this time, where basically you'll put up a brief online newscast, and you'll put it up at lunchtime when you think people are in the office and they've got a few minutes on break. So you see a few of these experiments around the time. The most ambitious, though, is Sam Donaldson at abcnews.com, which is actually the title of the webcast newscast, and also the email address where you could reach them to email your questions as it was on the air. This was live 3 days a week. So it was a live 15-minute lunchtime newscast, launched in 1999, and almost no one could watch it. Here's a few of the earlier reviews. It crashed my browser 3 times. It wasn't easier watching the archives. I was dismally failing to ignite the fuzzy 2-inch picture that is the best available. And the picture freezes, and an insistent noise, not unlike a woodpecker banging away at a tree trunk, racks the user's speakers. And my favorite review of user difficulty is that Donaldson himself could not get his own web show on his home computer. And so his son and a friend came over to fix it. So this has a lot of this difficulty has something to do with broadband issues as well as the problems with office firewalls and so forth. It's also worth remembering that web video meant something different at the time. It ran in a client application like Real Player if we're talking about live video. So just like you click a link in an email link in your web browser and it launches Outlook or something, the same type of thing would happen. It would launch this third-party program, Real Player, and basically that program had a bunch of finicky dependencies. It was really difficult to install for mere mortals. And Sam Donaldson's show didn't last long, but the fact that this stuff had a small audience and was a little bit niche also meant that it didn't eat very deeply into the network's existing business model. So they were relatively free to keep experimenting, and they launched ABC News Now soon after. And if you were, say, a grad student with broadband access at school in 2004, you could binge watch Nightline on ABC News Now because they actually did begin putting up a really full archive of their television news programming, which was pretty incredible at the time because up to that point, if you remember, if you wanted to see a news program that was a week old, you had to call up the Vanderbilt Television News Archive or send off for a tape or something like that. So this was pretty revolutionary, but it was also something that almost no one had. They try and sort of take it a little bit more mainstream, and so they become exclusive content provider for different cellular networks where you can sort of subscribe to their system and kind of drop the Real Player model. But that also means, if you think about what video on cell phones was like at the time, it was not getting good reviews. So this is it's like Mobi TV, which would provide some of these services. And basically, you have to remember that cell phones at the time had a 2-inch screen. You paid through the nose for data access, and when you tried to watch live video on it, it would come in at maybe 2 to 3 frames per second, and it would drain your cell phone battery like a nail gun through a water balloon. So basically it was a horrible user experience again, and they were locked into this contract for quite some time, and so News Now didn't kind of take off as a widespread phenomenon even after broadband became much more widely available. So lots of people sort of stick with the sort of lunchtime newscast model. So Washington Unplugged was a CBS effort. ABC News launched the World News webcast in the mid-2000s and so forth. And so you saw a lot of people kind of sticking with this model. One way of looking at it is a lot of the same sort of business pressures that Pablo was here last night kind of describes as impacting newspapers also happen to TV news, but broadband penetration gives the existing business model a lot more time to adapt. It's about 10 years before you have the same level of sort of access to video as you do text and pictures. Which moves us to kind of a discussion of business models. And so at least in the old days, every commercial broadcast news division wanted to have a cable channel. And the logic was that if you have 5 hours of news a day or 24, a lot of your costs are fixed. So it makes a lot of financial sense to sort of amortize those costs by spreading out the advertising over 24 hours. And not to mention pick up some fees from cable providers. And if you couldn't get your own cable channel, maybe the internet could be your cable channel. So ABC News Now is an example of this. Today, CBSN, if you watch CBS News online, as an example of that. Or at least you might be able to sell more ads against your existing newscasts if you would also air them online. So CBS became the first to do this. They ran a simulcast of their evening newscast on the web. And the affiliates hated it because they were worried that it was going to eat into their local television ratings. And if you ran a cable channel, the cable companies weren't too happy, or the cable companies weren't too happy about this either, because you'd basically be providing content for free that they were paying fees to run. So there's all these conflicts in the existing business model. So what you saw were a lot of television news online strategies that were kind of meant to sort of draw people into the regular broadcast schedule. So the 2-screen experience is sort of like the typical name for that today. So a lot of early experiments like this one in 2008. Newsvine is a subsidiary of MSNBC.com, or was at the time. And so they announced the Nightly News Discussion Club, which was basically a place where you could go on live and chat with other users through their social media network about television, the newscast as it was airing. And this takes us back into sort of the notion of consumer demand, and back to another reference to Pablo, because as he's pointed out, traffic to news sites sort of spikes during the day while people are at work, and so an internal mantra at msnbc.com is that daytime is their prime time. But if you're a homepage editor for a TV news organization in the 90s and the mid-2000s, for all the reasons we mentioned, there's not a whole lot of televised news video going online, and so you're basically running a newspaper site. And so if you look at the homepages of these different news sites, they look a lot like the homepages of different newspapers and news portals, and not so much like the video sites that you see around the same time. And so that's another thing that's sort of revealing about the editorial priorities of these TV news homepages is where they put the TV news, which is like way up there in the corner, right? That's where you get to all of their primetime, like flagship programming for MSNBC. The same thing is happening at CBS News' website, and you actually have to click a drop-down menu on ABC News' website to get to the shows, right? So what's going on here? So basically, because they're not getting television programming on the web for the most part, or at least not the same stuff that's airing on TV. These websites over time can become editorially independent. They have like different sort of staffing structures to populate them with content because they're competing during the day with newspapers, not with television stations, basically. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the content that they produce sort of diminishes very quickly in value. And so basically, if you put up a clip of the nightly news of like 15 hours later when people are stumbling into their desks at the office, then basically you're literally putting up yesterday's news, and that's not going to help you compete with these others. If you have a weekly brand that's producing 1 hour television a week, that's not nearly enough to populate your site. At one point, David Gregory starts his own website to promote Meet the Press because it's so marginal on their website. And so by contrast, we look at the things that now in the age of broadband, the things that people are really excited about, they're the morning shows, for example, because they're producing content during the day while people are at work, and all of that content is extremely timely. So I am up with my 12 minutes, so I'm going to cut it off here, but I'm happy to take questions and talk about this during lunch and everything else. But there's not much left, but I'm going to have to hand it off here.
Our next presenter is Matthew Pittman from the University of Oregon, who will present his paper on Who Binges, What and Why, Effects of Personality and Loneliness on Binging Preferences and Enjoyment.
Good morning. Matthew Pittman, University of Oregon. So this, obviously I'm going to talk about binging today. I defend my dissertation in 3 weeks, so that's the world I've been living on. That has nothing to do with binge watching. That's social media and loneliness, and how people use social media in relationships. And I even had this beautiful color-coded chart of how they use it versus phone tracking, how they actually used it and what their self-reported data. And I thought my color-coded chart was so beautiful and clever. And then yesterday, Byron Reeves presented some of that data. It was like way more beautiful, way more powerful. Left feeling pretty humbled. So to pick up this research that I did last year and haven't touched in a couple months was actually fun. This is kind of like you have your main research area and the other kind of fun stuff. And this is also with Heather Schoenberger, who's a colleague at Oregon. So the nice thing about a boutique conference like this where it's focused, you don't have to do a lit review. Normally you have to like justify why this is important. Here's why we study this. No, we're all on board. That's why we're here. We think this merits study. So the general narrative that binge watching has in the press is usually stuff like this. If your family members know that you study, you probably get emails from aunts or like, hey, is this bad? Do you look at this? And it's always a negative story, like there's kind of a moral panic cycle. A new thing comes out, there's celebrants and the skeptics usually point out all the stuff that's bad. But unhealthy people are going to do unhealthy things with whatever the technology is. So yeah, binging is typically negative, and it has been linked to a variety of unhealthy physical and emotional activities and behaviors, though we do have other terms. So Lisa has, I like the term media marathoning. She has a book by that. And actually, Lisa and I were on the first binge watching way back in 2014 at NCA, and it was the two of us, and back then we had to justify, like, no, I think this is a thing that might be happening. It's kind of important. So, yeah, the term has negative connotations, so part of what I hope we come away with this conference is, like, what does that term mean, and how do we define it? So my main question is, do we actually enjoy the process of binge watching? Which sounds obvious and common sense. Surely we do, because it happens so much. But part of, as I started to binge more, and people I know started to binge more, I started to wonder, do we do it because we like it, or do we do it because it's there? Like the mountain, like, why'd you climb Everest? Well, it's there, so I did it. Well, there's more content that I can get all in a row. And I also wanted to think about what role personality, so the personality scales I use in here are the Big Five inventory. For those that aren't familiar, that's extroversion, openness, how open you are to new experiences, like, yeah, I'll go do this thing now. Neuroticism, how much you worry and think about things. Agreeableness, if you're just like a nice, Seth Lewis would be highly agreeable, just like a really chill person to be around. And conscientiousness, which is the one that keeps coming up in my other social media research, and that's people that are determined, disciplined. Anybody, if you know anyone who can stick to a diet and actually adhere to it for a long time, they're highly conscientious, like self-awareness. And then well-being. So emotional well-being, this is what I look at this in my dissertation too, so loneliness and happiness are the two factors that I look at in here, and they're not opposite, but they are antithetical. So the loneliness, the definition of loneliness that I always use is, it's the emotional distress we feel at the difference between our perceived social support and our ideal social support. So if an introvert doesn't really want that much social support, and they don't have a lot, then they're not going to be lonely. They don't really care. But someone who's more extroverted, or somebody who really wants, like, I wish I had more friends, and then if they have a low level, then that's a greater difference, then they'll be alone there. So two-part study, a survey and an experiment. And Sarah, the experiment you talked about yesterday, I was getting post-traumatic stress flashbacks thinking about to going through that. Ours was, I think your experiment design was better than ours, but we'll get there. So the survey research questions, first of all, any genre preferences, like, people talk a lot about what was first produced, like Netflix, big thing was House of Cards, and they had Orange is the New Black, and all the original stuff's really good. But they quickly added all other content too, so I wanted to know what people wanted to watch. Does loneliness or happiness actually predict binge frequency? This was a big, I think I got 30 emails the day some thing came out saying lonely people binge more. It's like, well, of course, if you're lonely and you're home alone now, there's a lot of things you'll do more of. Maybe that's binge watch, I didn't think it was causational. I thought it was just a correlation, but I still wanted to test it. And then do any of the Big Five traits play a role? So genre preferences, this is a little, we get to quiz you. So what do people like to watch alone? Keep in mind this is a sample. This is all college students, which has pros and cons. So college students, if those are the genres I asked about, what do you think college students like to watch when they're alone? This is not rhetorical. I'm curious what people think. Drama. Who said drama? Yeah. So, by the way, there was some researcher tweeted like a month or two ago, man, I hate when I'm at conferences and people put up regression tables. Those numbers mean nothing to us. Don't show us that. Show us like data and make it pretty. So I still have some numbers in here, and I know a lot of us have numbers, but I also try to present it in different ways, because when you are looking at SPSS for weeks, the numbers speak to you, but they don't speak to other people all the time. So, all right. What do people like to watch in a small group, one or two others? Comedy, still some drama, makeover shows. A romantic partner. This is where Jacob or whoever was tweeting about this had some like Netflix and chill jokes. I've been asking people about this for years, so I have actual slides that have Netflix and chill data that I'm going to show in a few minutes. I take what I do seriously, but I don't take myself seriously, so I like to include But I was curious. So, turns out, what are you watching when you're Netflix and chilling? It's horror. You want to get arousal levels up, get excited. And horror was also the lowest for watching alone. Nobody wants to be creeped out when they're by themselves. What do people like to watch in a large group of people? This was clearly reality shows and comedies, and this kind of was confusing. Then I thought of, like bachelor watch parties or like, groups, and college students. So, and in our School of Journalism and Communication, there's a lot of Greek students, so I think sororities have like, if there's one sorority in our class, that explains that finding right there. So does loneliness or happiness, do either one of those predict binge frequency for college students? Nod your head yes if you think it does, or no if you think that it does not. You're all so smart. No, and this one was kind of close, but not really. So do extroversion, do any of the big five predict binge frequency? Two of them do. And it's extroversion and conscientiousness. So conscientiousness was the stronger predictor here. So that kind of makes sense. Extroverts are more people-oriented. So maybe after an episode or two, they're thinking, I'd rather go be with my friends. I don't want to watch this alone. And the conscientiousness is the type A, the planners. That made more sense to me. If you're highly conscientious, after a couple episodes, you're probably like, I'm not productive. I should be like doing homework or doing my taxes or something. Bonus. So I asked about how often do you binge watch alone, and then how often would you like to binge watch alone? And I asked that for the 4 groups. So the answer for themselves was negative. That means they wish they had to binge watch by themselves less frequently, but they want to watch a little more with a friend and a little more in a group. And when I asked about a romantic partner, everybody wants to Netflix and chill way, way more. That was the highest. That was, significantly higher. So for the experiment, when Sarah was talking about that yesterday, it's hard to do an experiment with binge watching with millennials because you have to find a show they haven't seen, but something that's good enough that they're going to want to watch it. And for this study, I deliberately chose a show. So you went with narrative engagement. I chose a show specifically to not test narrative engagement. Because to me, that seemed clearly like, if I got hooked on the OC in like 2000 whatever, because I watched 3 episodes on TV and now I want to know what happens to like this kid from Chino. So I chose a show that has no narrative arc from one episode to the next. And it's a comedy, 20 minutes, and since we did not, again, I'm an optimist, but I don't trust 19-year-olds, so I didn't trust them to go home and watch it, so we ran this. So I sat in a hallway, and they watched it in an office that was like our lab, and it's a cold environment. I know it's not like their home environment. I wanted to isolate it, so the only difference was how they consumed it. So the appointment condition was 1 episode of 30 Rock a week for 3 weeks. Binge condition 3 in a row. The hypotheses based on the first study were that extroverts and conscientious individuals will enjoy binging less. And then I wanted to see if any other factors, maybe loneliness didn't turn up in the survey, maybe it would here. Do introverts enjoy binging less? Yes, they did. So on the left is the appointment condition. Blue is introverts, red's extroverts. Their enjoyment went down. As they binge, introverts went way up. This makes sense if introverts get recharged when they're alone. Sitting in an office alone for an hour to watch these 3 episodes was really enjoyable to them. Conscientiousness predicts enjoy binging less. This also is true. Nice interaction effect there. Highly conscientious people enjoyed it less. Do lonely people enjoy binging more? I thought they would still. Yes, kind of, but it wasn't significant. So this looks good, so I put it in here, but it's not. It's a lie. Data can be deceiving. Other random findings. So people who were more likely to binge watch in groups enjoyed 30 Rock. So I wonder if it's because they have positive connotations. Again, with research questions, there's always so many. I'll skip the limitations because we all are aware of the pros and cons of corgis have limits, and I have a corgi, so I thought it was appropriate. So there's potential, but I'm going to skip that. So word cloud, what does it mean to Netflix and chill? Removing the words Netflix and chill because that's obvious. So this is interesting. I can show you during lunch if we want. The most interesting things are what's really small, like Oreo turned up twice. 2 people, that's so specific. What are you doing with the Oreos? And then what's next, kind of what I want for us here. So is it binge watching, media marathoning? Maybe one has a positive connotation, like I'm looking forward to binging on this season when it comes out, or media marathoning, and then maybe one's negative, like when binge watching becomes hate watching, like I just got to finish this because I'm done. And then there's binging comes from time-indifferent user traits and situational factors. All these are have great potential, and I hope that somebody can study these. Thanks.
Our next presenters are from Boston University, Sarah Krongard and Mina Tsay-Vogel, who will present on Bingeing Violence, online original TV series cultivating social reality perceptions.
Thanks. This guy? This guy?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you have any sound?
No.
Okay. Is this your presentation?
It is.
Okay, cool.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Krongard. I'm a second-year PhD student here at BU. I'll be presenting a research project I conducted with Dr. Mina Tsay-Vogel on the ways in which violence is depicted in commonly binge-watched online original series and the ways in which it potentially cultivates reality perceptions among viewers. So just a brief agenda slide, start out with an overview, research rationale. This project is comprised of 2 studies, so we'll go through study 1, then study 2, and wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. So cultivation is kind of at the core of this project, and as I'm sure you all know, cultivation theory looks at the relationship between television consumption and perceptions of social reality. So just really quickly to go through some of the core fundamental ideas about cultivation. Human beings are storytellers innately, and television serves as a means of communicating and sharing these stories through a commercial central system. And the stories shared via television are often repeated, so we see a lot of the same patterns over and over again with regard to stereotypical representations of gender, race, and often depictions of violence. So as far as effects go, cultivation theory has found that heavy doses of television lead to perceptions of social reality as seen through the lens of TV, these ideologies conveyed through television. And again, this was created by Gerbner in the 70s, so a very different time as far as television goes, different landscape, very linear, synchronous, shared environment. So this project, we're looking at cultivation in the post-network era and what this might mean. So how does digital streaming, a nonlinear, very personalized television landscape connect with this idea of cultivation, or does it? So we're thinking about this idea of binge watching, which we've been discussing over the past 2 days. And as cultivation thinks very strongly about time, so long-term exposure to violence, like a drip-drop effect, how does this apply when we're binging content, in a really concentrated, shorter period of time? What is the relationship here? And so we're focusing on the programs that are created for this digital environment, online original programs. So our first study, we wanted to look at the content, so a content analysis examining the prevalent depictions of violence in commonly binge-watched Netflix original series. So we ended up going with Netflix because, while most of this data is actually proprietary and we can't access the actual numbers from Netflix or Hulu, there are third-party sources that have identified the top binge-watch programs. So we cross-referenced all these third-party sources and identified the top 5 binge-watch shows from the fall of 2015. So as you see, we have House of Cards, Marco Polo, Daredevil, Narcos, and Kimmy Schmidt. So we developed a coding schema based on prior content analyses that have been conducted in the traditional television landscape. We trained a group of coders, and when we finally reached intercoder reliability, we then coded for the first season of each of these programs. And I'll go through the measures a little bit. So we examined the frequency of violence, taking into account prior research on traditional television violence, so mostly by cultivation researchers, Signorelli, Gerbner, and his crew. So we were looking at frequency and amount of violence in these binge watch programs. We wanted to look also at the nature of violence. So thinking about how violence is presented, what is the context? So from a lens of social learning, perhaps the way in which violence is portrayed might influence how people perceive it, as well as desensitization. So we looked at explicitness, the sexual nature of violence, seriousness versus hubris, significance to the plot, graphicness, and intentionality. And these were all based on prior content analysis and cultivation. So we also looked at justification, so whether the violent acts were morally justified, taking some Bandura, this idea of moral disengagement, how do we kind of separate ourselves from these violent behaviors? Again, Signorelli's views of traditional television and then work in video games as well. So we were looking at how justified was the behavior, looking at advantageous comparisons, so saying like, my violent behavior is, less immoral than that guy's. So like I fight with my fists, not guns. Defending the powerless, so like did I kill the bad guy because he was hurting a puppy? Or fighting for the greater good, like killing an evil mastermind because he was gonna blow up the world. And displaying empathy. So this is where we pivoted a bit from prior research. We wanted to look at the ways in which other characters demonstrated or didn't demonstrate empathy towards perpetrators. So then we looked at the identities of the targets and perpetrators from a few different lenses. So Gerbner asserted way back in the day that violence is really just demonstrations of power and privilege and oppression. So this is typically from a race and gender perspective, the idea that who's victimized really demonstrates on who lacks power in the situation. So we wanted to look at their identities. We also wanted to look at whether their identities were a function of the nature of violence. So for example, do white women receive violence more frequently or receive sexualized violence more frequently than other characters? So those kinds of relationships we were examining. And also looking at the identities as functions of justification. So who gets to have like the morally laudable violent portrayals? So some findings. As far as amount goes, 5.9 instances per hour, that's 8.5% of each hour. And they were generally pretty intense. We had really explicit, graphic, serious, significant, intentional violence with very little moral justification. Those who did receive moral justification tended to be white males. And with regard to our 4 through 6 research questions, I'll go in more depth. But again, there's more perpetuation of these harmful gender and racial stereotypes. So sorry about all the tables, but so we're looking at functions. So these are kind of a mouthful. Let me just refer here to my notes. But so in thinking about perpetrator characteristics as a function of the nature of violence, we saw differences among gender and race. So as far as perpetrators go, males were likely to be perpetrators of non-sexual violence versus sexual, while women tended to be perpetrators of sexual versus non-sexual violence, which was surprising at first. But in thinking about the fact that women tend to be portrayed in more hypersexualized ways, we assume that it's just like they're sexualizing the entire environment when women are involved. And men were more likely to be perpetrators of intentional versus non-intentional, where women were the opposite. And white perpetrators tended to be more likely to perpetrate non-sexual violence as opposed to sexual, while people of color tended to perpetrate sexual versus not sexual violence. So we have this representation of non-white people as sexually threatening, which we found shocking and upsetting. Well, not shocking, unfortunately, but we see these stereotypes over and over, not really shifting from traditional representations. So in thinking about targets, we have similar we have similar findings here. So males were more likely to be the targets of non-sexual as opposed to sexual violence, whereas opposite for women. White characters were more likely to be the targets of non-sexual versus sexual, and opposite for people of color. So I'll kind of move through these more quickly. And then as far as justification, as I mentioned earlier, white characters were more likely to justify their violence using fighting for the greater good or moral or advantageous comparison, and people of color, it was the opposite. And then as far as targets go, men were more likely to be the targets when the fighting was for the greater good, and women were the opposite. So I know this is kind of a lot of numbers and a lot of directionality, and if you have questions about it, I'm happy to dig into more depth. But so with study 2, we were looking for effects, or potential effects, implications, with regard to mean world and kind world syndromes. So thinking about viewers and how they receive these messages. So many of you are probably familiar with mean world syndrome. We have this repeated idea that heavy exposure to media you tend to perceive the world as a scary, terrifying place. And kind world is a more recent development where we're looking at the opposite. Is the world a more altruistic, giving, kind place? So our hypothesis was that the first is that exposure to these commonly binge-watch programs would be positive related to mean world and negatively related to kind world. So we had a sample of 360 undergrad students, these guys right here. We looked at general TV viewing, traditional versus streaming, TV affinity, so how important was TV to these individuals' lives. And then we measured their viewing of commonly binge-watch programs, so using the data from the sample for the content analysis. We also looked at social reality perceptions, so mean world, asking questions, do they agree with the statements such as, people would try to take advantage of me if they could, and then kind world, asking questions such as, most people do good deeds. And our findings supported our hypotheses. So for mean world perceptions, viewing content on online streaming platforms related positively towards mean world perceptions, and same with watching these specific 5 programs that we analyzed in the content analysis. And with kind world, we had a little bit of a difference here, but we see that viewing these commonly binge-watch programs, these 5, related negatively to kind world. So we see that those who watch these programs that we analyzed see the world as a scarier place. So as far as this discussion goes, I think the content overall is just really intense, notably intense violence, depicting harmful stereotypes with regard to race and gender and with little moral justification. And our viewers are demonstrating mean and kind world effects as we anticipated, in alignment with prior cultivation theory in the traditional world. So we feel that this is a contribution in that there is relevance to this more traditional media theory in a digital environment. But for future research, I think we need to expand the sample. We only looked at 5, so how might this apply? And of course, as we know, what's popular changes like every week. So a new show will come out and replace the other popular ones. So we need to keep going with this work. And I think it's important to also look at genre differences. We looked at 4 dramas and a comedy, so we couldn't do much work with genre. And finally, thinking more about cultivation in online environments and how that might be applied. So thank you.
Our final presentation is by Lisa Perks from Merrimack College, who will present her research on media marathoning through health struggles, coping, and connecting.
Thank you. I told the other presenters I didn't think I was going to use a PowerPoint because I am a humanist. We don't always do that, but I caved. So hopefully it will do me a solid and show up properly. Awesome. We're getting there. Okay. Let's see the presenter view. All right, so my presenter view is actually not showing up. Let me just grab, if you don't mind, open up my laptop. So I can talk and click at the same time. This project was inspired by the bigger media marathoning project that Matt referenced. So I had a lot of interviewees who were media marathoners, and without asking them, many of them talked about the health-related reasons why they marathoned. And so I wanted to take a deeper dive into understanding that connection potentially between health struggles and media marathoning. And I will say that I don't think doctors are currently writing media marathoning prescriptions, but a lot of people are certainly self-medicating in that way. So there's a lot more to explore there. And one particular quote from the media marathoning book is from Roberta. So a lot of people said, I marathoned because I had the stomach bug or the flu, or one mentioned I was on medication that made me really foggy and I couldn't focus on anything other than TV. But Roberta emailed me after her interview and said, I want this to be part of my story with media marathoning. And you can see up here, Roberta's the pseudonym. Quote, a number of years ago, I had a miscarriage. During my week of rest and recovery, Hogwarts is where I went for solace. So she took a lot of comfort in this familiar world, these familiar characters. And I wanted to see how other people were potentially strategically using media marathoning during this difficult time, whatever they were facing. So for the media marathoning and health study, I had 12 semi-structured interviews that took place from June to December of last year. They were all marathoning while experiencing health problems, and this is the language I used in recruitment. A health-related concern kept you out of work or school or rendered you unable to conduct normal daily activities for at least one day. And so experiencing that health problem and media marathoning I define as watching a season of a show in a week or less, watching 3 or more films from the same series in a week or less, or reading 3 or more books from the same series in a month or less. And I know that's not necessarily the full story journey or the full narrative journey, but it gives you a deeper dive into the story rather than some definitions of binge watching that could be 2 or 3 episodes a day or in one sitting. So if I watch 2 or 3 episodes of one show one day, that's counted as binge watching. The next day I might turn to a completely different show or watch 3 different shows. And so with this definition of media marathoning, I do want that more holistic engagement and to capture that. And I analyzed my transcripts using grounded theory. So lit review, further study questions, methodology questions, feel free to ask those at the end. I call it lit review light for this 12-minute presentation. So here are some of the key things that I needed to draw from social support and social capital as well, coping and parasocial relationships. All right, so focusing on the meat of the presentation here, what's the story? I have 3 major themes that I'll talk about today. And just to be clear, the transcripts yielded fodder for another paper, so there was a lot of escapism. There was also an interesting divergence of some people wanting cognitive engagement through media and some people wanting to check out. So depending on what they were going through, those were 2 robust themes from the transcripts that I found. But I found this collection of themes that was really oriented around connections and relationships. So parasocial encouragement is the first theme that I'll discuss. And I clarify this as seeing that interviewees formed really meaningful parasocial relationships with the characters. And it was specifically the characters' struggles and their perseverance that inspired the interviewees to sometimes be more optimistic about what they were going through or to feel more agentic in their health struggles. The second theme is connecting with real others. So many people were marathoning with others, but we know when you're sick or you're ill, a lot of times you're left alone. Other people are going to work and going about their business. And so when that happened, some people would pick up a story that someone recommended and then talk about it later. So it was sometimes synchronous and co-viewing, and sometimes it was asynchronous and connecting with others that way. And then the last theme I'll develop is this idea of fortification in the face of mental illness. So I had 3 interviewees who were dealing with depression and or anxiety, and they thought that the media marathoning helped them broaden their worldview and actually be ready to then go out in the world and connect with other people. So my conclusion is that these collections of experiences help people maintain a semblance of social normalcy while they're coping with all of these different issues, potentially pain, restricted mobility, social anxiety, isolation. So we'll look with more depth into parasocial encouragement. And I have the stories from 2 different people in each theme, but there are, of course, more examples from the interviews. So I'll start with Glenn, and I'm calling him a cycling tribute. So I'll explain that in a moment. Just to give you some demographics as we go, Glenn's a Caucasian man, age 32 at the time of the interview. And he had a running injury, and running was part of his normal every day. And so he figured that he qualified for the study, and I let them self-determine if they felt that they qualified for the study. But he was marathoning the books of the Hunger Games. And so I called him a cycling tribute. He was riding a stationary bike, which he found very boring and frustrating, instead of running. And so what Glenn said is that he really connected with Katniss. So he said Katniss does describe several ordeals that she had to go through, and she would describe having to deal with physical fatigue and pain, and basically gritting her teeth and enduring it. While I was injured and not happy and in pain, I did find myself identifying with that. So Katniss's struggles helped Glenn stay on that bike for longer than he would have if he didn't have the marathon book reading. And I have Maria, who's a Caucasian woman, age 63. So I'll keep her character connection in the dark for a moment and see if maybe you can guess it. So Maria didn't have this physical struggle that her character went through. They connected instead based on adverse conditions and trying to deal with that adversity in an optimistic and gracious kind of way. So Maria said this about the character she connected with. Quote, "She was kind of in a situation that was beyond her control, and she was funny, and she handled it with grace. Maybe I identified with her a little bit because she was dealing with adversity and of how she dealt with it." So Maria's language is very tentative. You know, she's not saying, yep, this is my girl, this is my character I connect with. But can you guess who she might be connecting with from a popular TV series? Who's dealing with adversity with grace? Like everybody, right? It was actually, and I have to take 3 clicks, Piper Chapman. So Maria was actually dealing with cancer treatments and a cancer surgery. She described her hospital situation as one of imprisonment. She didn't use those exact words, but when describing that connection with Piper Chapman, she said to me then, "The lights are on all the time. There's noise all the time. It's hard for me to know what time of day it is in the hospital." And it seems to describe some of the scenes, and I believe it's Litchfield from Orange is the New Black. So I'll move next to connecting with real others. And in this theme, there was a triangulation of self, character, and then conversation partners. So I'll start with the story from Isabel, who's a Latina woman, age 32, and she had a new baby, so she was recovering from childbirth, and then she was going through that process of getting to know her baby, but also being home while everyone else was at work or school. And so marathoning afforded her this site of connection, this point of connection with other people. So she said, quote, "You know, I'm going to watch my show, and I'm going to catch up with all these people." And the first reference to people is actually characters. I had her clarify that. So I'm going to catch up with all of these people, these characters. And when I go on Facebook, I can at least talk to other people, so real people, through it that way. For me, it gave me a connection to the outside world. So that was an important thing for her to have those conversations. And Daniel, who's a Caucasian man, age 46, co-viewed with his young children. And so you might think of Bob the Builder being a really good story or a good kind of show for the kids, but not so much for the adults. So they watched the human version of Bob the Builder in this old house. And so the boys really liked watching what tools they used and seeing stuff like that because their home had been remodeled. And Daniel got some good remodeling ideas for the next iteration of what they were going to do at the house. And that was important because he couldn't play with the kids. He had a shoulder injury and was essentially on bed rest or staying seated for most of the time. So this was a point of connection for them to watch 3 or 4 episodes a day together. So the last theme is fortifying against mental illness. And I'll tell you about Abby, who said that movies helped her build relationships with people. And she's an African-American woman, age 27. She described herself as, quote, "an introvert and melancholic." And when she first came to the United States as an international student, she had a hard time connecting with others, and this was a challenge for her. So she turned to movies that were specifically about relationships. And so she enjoyed the movies and then said, quote, "At the same time, try to understand people better and know how to relate with them." So those were her goals, right? This movie enjoyment, but also some social learning from it. And Helen, Caucasian woman, age 46, was really involved in online fan communities. So she had a lot of familiar shows that she went back to, and she was struggling with depression and anxiety and a chronic health condition. Abby identified herself as depressed, and that's kind of the list that Helen provided. So many different issues for her. And so those different familiar shows were very important, and the fan communities were key for her as well. And she said in regard to her fan communities online, quote, "It's awesome because we all talk about the shows. And we're like, nobody else would understand what we're talking about, but we understand each other. And this is one of the fan communities she talked about, and I hadn't heard of it before, but Superhighway. Yeah, anybody else interested in that? So Supernatural, okay, thank you, Mark, Doctor Who, and Sherlock. So this amalgam was interesting to her. And this quote from Helen at the end of her interview was really important to me. She said, "I watch my show, my anxiety gets a little better, then I can leave my house." So she wasn't getting rid of her anxiety, but she was coping with it on a daily basis by dipping into some of these familiar shows, familiar stories, and then fortifying herself to go out in the world. So some of the conclusions from this study, I would say we see some contrast with the couch potato stereotype. So couch potato, we've got isolation, we've got hopelessness, sometimes helplessness. But with our media marathoners, there was a sense of really forging these social connections because of media marathoning and being inspired by the characters. The story familiarity mattered to the people. So I did ask every interviewee, contrast this experience to just flipping through the channels or just reading books by different authors in a row. And they all said that that continuity with that story world was important to them. And I will note, too, with the marathoning metaphor, if you're an actual runner who does marathons, the 2 weeks before your marathon is the taper. You reduce your mileage, you rest your legs. And a little bit of a different phenomenon here, but all of the, not all, 10 out of 12 interviewees said to me that they eased off the marathon and would cut down to maybe 1 episode or 2 as they started to feel better. So this was not something that they were always doing. Right? They were easing off of it as their conditions and their health circumstances changed. So from this, I think we conclude that the best medicine is to marathon as needed. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our formal presentations. Thank you to all our presenters. I would like to now invite our discussant, Kate Mays, to present her thoughts and comments on these presentations.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I want to thank the presenters for such a great mix of papers and data and analysis here for us. I think it's really interesting, the mix of the inductive and deductive approaches that you guys are bringing to the table to discuss this issue. It sort of presents a multifaceted look at the same issue. It reminds Byron Reeves yesterday at his talk was talking about this sort of inductive approach to explore the ways in which our lives are mediatized and fragmented and understand that. And in this way, I think with binging, we also have the fragmentation of different kinds of content, right, in this environment of online TV shows. You have a lot of different kinds of TV shows, a lot of different modes of viewing, and even different ways of binging, I think, as Lisa shows us. And so with that, I'm going to start with Matthew's paper and then move to Lisa and Sarah and then finish with Josh. So Matthew, I think it's really interesting the ways in which you were looking at, you gave us an analysis of personality traits and modes of viewing in terms of which genres. And I think, when you were looking at genre preferences, was that binge watching for genre preferences, or was it just watching?
Yeah,
It
that
wasn't
question
clear.
was when you binge watch TV, what do you?
Binge watch TV.
So there's still the room for the occasional, like, although no college students have cable anymore, so I don't know how it's almost all Netflix.
Right. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting that it's not binge watching as a singular mode of activity, but really depends on both the genre and the social context. In terms of your experiment, I think it was really an interesting thing to look at in terms of extroversion and the personality traits. I would have been interested in different conditions with different genres. So based on your survey, people do like binge watching comedies in groups. And so that finding that if you watch in a group, you're going to like 30 Rock more, and how that might change in terms of a drama where people prefer watching that alone. And to that end, sort of whether we should parse, and you talked about this at the end of your presentation, parse out more binging as a social activity versus a personal activity, which Lisa gets to as well. And whether we should have different terms to distinguish between binging alone versus watching with others, if that's a distinctly different mode of viewing and serves different needs. And then Lisa's really interesting, a very niche reason that you present for the binge watching, which I liked, sort of a very narrow perspective on different ways that that binging can serve people, and the focus on the individual and private experience of marathoning, but then how that can create connection and relations for people. And as opposed to Matthew shows that where people are worried about the unhealthiness of binge watching potentially, but that you show really a lot of pro-social effects in terms of sorry, I should use media marathoning when I'm talking about your study, right? That it performs functions of social support and connection and coping. And I think it's interesting that there are these social learning functions that people had in some of those cases, and I'd be interested how those. So you're looking at a temporary event of marathoning while you have a specific illness, but then how those social learning kinds of effects can go in and out of people's lives, potentially. So within the health event, but then how that extends more longitudinally in their lives, particularly in mental illness is more of a chronic condition. So if people are preempting and whatever with media marathoning as to cope with their illness. And I also think that it would be this issue of escapism versus engagement in the narrative is interesting. So how much is it escapist versus specifically agentic for certain connecting reasons, and how those interact, I guess, if it's one versus the other, or if they're sort of co-activated in that. And then Sarah brings an important step in terms of whether this comparison traditional versus the online new media to see, and it's interesting that we say we're in a golden age of TV and that there's fragmented media content, so you can get all these new different kinds of stories, and it's a really progressive age, but then you find that actually these narratives are the exact same, or they're repeating the same themes that we saw in traditional TV, which is a little depressing based on what the prognostications have been otherwise. So I think that's really important, and also that we see the same effects that traditional cultivation has shown in terms of amount of viewing. And it wasn't clear to me exactly in the survey whether the rate of watching the TV shows whether you measured that at all, because it looked like it was just the amount that you were looking at. So whether they watched 1 to 2 episodes or 3 to 4 episodes or the whole thing, and the rate at which they were consuming that, and whether that matters in terms of actually binging the content specifically compared to maybe appointment viewing the content still over time, and how that might have a specific, like a higher cultivation effect if you're consuming it more intensely versus over time. Right, so is it the mode of viewing that matters, or is it just the overall consumption that matters, I suppose is what I'm asking, because binging is a different mode, but I'm not sure if that's, and you can speak more to that, if you measure that specifically in terms of the effects. Yeah.
Is this rhetorical or right now?
Rhetorical, I guess? Sorry.
Very rhetorical question.
Yeah. Well, just so if you could speak to that in a little bit.
I think I'll have to go back and look at exactly the questions that we asked, but we were mostly looking at quantity. I don't believe we looked at like how long, over what period of time. It was more of overall quantity. But I'll double check in the paper and just remember.
Yeah. So it would be interesting whether if that kind of supposed intense engagement or more intense engagement with the video if you're watching it over time, specifically as it might, I just lost my train of thought, but as it might relate to what Matthew was looking at in terms of group versus alone viewing. Yeah. So are these effects changed or moderated by the context in which we're watching these shows? And I think that would be really interesting for further study on the effects of this kind of violent content, particularly. And then Josh broadens us out to look at the overall media landscape, and more TV news and less, the rest is more fictional TV content. But a really interesting exploration of how you have technological infrastructure and consumer demand, and these things are sometimes at odds, but sometimes help push people along. Interesting, the notion of potentially binge-watching news programs. that was an interesting idea that I don't know how much, whether it's sort of do we binge-watch, and I think Matthew brought this up, do we binge-watch because the technology enables that, or is that actually what we want to do?
I doubt people actually do it.
But this question of whether the infrastructure creates the demand or whether the demand is there and therefore the technology follows. And you didn't get to this slide, but I hope you'll speak more to that really interesting matrix of timeliness and exclusivity as it relates to different genres, and potentially viewing patterns in terms of binging or not. And those are my thoughts, and I look forward to all of your questions on this selection of papers. Thank you.
Questions?
So I'm Sarah Erickson. Anyone who was here yesterday will be unsurprised to learn that I found this panel very, very interesting. I had a question for Lisa, though. I've been thinking lately about the use of media in the face of adversity, and I'm like at this point where I'm trying to figure out what's my next project, and thinking a lot about mental health. And something that I've wondered is, and I thought maybe you could speak to this with your participants, when we were talking about the woman who had the miscarriage, I think she said she went to Hogwarts, right? Was that a new narrative, or was that a familiar narrative? Like, are people, not just familiar, like I know these characters, but familiar, like I have watched this exact thing before, and so I'm going back and watching it again as a comfort.
I think that's a great question. And for that particular participant, she definitely knew Hogwarts. That wasn't a new thing for her. And I think given her experience, she was looking for that familiar comfort. Several interviewees did, for this particular study, say they picked up an old familiar show that they knew they liked, in part because of their health uncertainty. They didn't know how they would heal or if they would heal completely. So many of them wanted that certainty of, like, I know I like this and I'm going to feel good here. But I think that's a great question to ask. And there's an essay, a study on underdog narratives. I believe her first name's Abby, but it's Preston is the last name. And she found that people's hope was increased watching underdog narratives, not even in a binge-watching fashion. And it lasted for at least a week. So that might be a good study to look at.
Hi, my name is Emil Steiner. I'm from Temple. First of all, great job, everybody up there. It's just so wonderful that there can be a conference dedicated to binge watching. As somebody who studies it, all the time, but doesn't really see too many people around me studying it. I was actually saying to my wife last night, it's sort of like felt like the bumblebee girl in the Blind Melon video who finds the garden where everybody's dancing like she is. But one thing that I want to bring up, Matt, I can really relate to the sort of idea of friends and family sort of asking, is this bad for you, or is this good for you, or what how should we interpret this in terms of our health? And I often find that really frustrating, because it's the people I talk to about binge watching, the interviews I do, and the newspapers that report on it. It seems to be more of kind of an ambivalent thing, it's sort of there's pride and there's shame. And I wonder, looking at what you did and what Lisa's doing with her project, it almost seems like we're kind of looking to see if there is a good or bad in there. And I was wondering, maybe, do you think we're searching for that because of sort of external sort of pressures on binge watching, people asking us, is it good for you or is it bad for you, in order to find answers to that question?
So, yeah, this is sort of a common technology question. Is it good or evil? And some people would say most technologies are neutral, so it's how we use them that matters. I would imagine, so for the dissertation data that I've been mostly in, which tracks loneliness and how much people use each platform, social media are emotionally healthy, and it's helpful to a point, and there's diminishing returns. And then, like an hour of Instagram or Snapchat a day, that's fine. And then once you go past that, then you're actually disconnecting yourself from the humans that you were. So I imagine, if I had to guess, I'd say binge watching is probably the same, like in moderation, whatever that means. That varies by person, by preference, introvert, extrovert, whatever. but I would probably say that most people could benefit socially, emotionally, whatever, from going through a season of whatever their favorite thing is now and then. But certainly there's a diminishing returns where you get like all the gifts that I put up. Like if you Google like binge gif or binge like skits or the narrative online is like, oh, look at this shut in. They're overweight. They haven't slept in 2 weeks. That kind of stuff. So that's like a joke, but I'm sure that would be at that extreme. But anything has the like pro-social potential in moderation, I would say.
And I think if we're going to look at binge watching or media marathoning more thoroughly, we need to look at people's, and I mentioned this at dinner, like their rhythms over a year. So I had a spike of viewing because I had my tonsils out and I couldn't do much of anything. And that was a good thing for me to not just sit there and twiddle my thumbs. But if that's an everyday, many hours a day problem, well, I already labeled it a problem. I do think there's that unhealthiness there. But one of the answers to this question, too, that I think is important is that when we see, like, oh, binge watchers, they're lonely, they're depressed, right, these news stories that Emil talked about, we're not thinking about the average viewing experience. So the average person is watching, right, 4+ hours a day. Well, I think there's a difference between watching that much general TV, flipping channels, and really being absorbed into an engaging narrative. So I think we need to be parsing out not just how long you're viewing, but what you're viewing and the consistency of viewing.
I just wanted to jump in briefly. So I mean, I think so. I gave like kind of a flip answer before, but when we're talking about sort of the design of technologies or the editorial design of content, when it comes to news, there are some things about this. So for example, TV news, they'll cut everything into clips, right? So like there's the segments on the Today Show or something along those lines, and they'll basically they'll create a bunch of different sorts of playlists, and the idea is that each one will draw people in for multiple videos, right? And ideally it's about monetization and that kind of thing. But so if you're watching a fashion segment, you'll find 3 and 4 fashion segments playing afterwards. The idea is to keep you viewing that, or you'll find the show in a linear order, whatever is going to keep you watching for the longest period of time. And one of the reasons that you have like the daytime television shows being prioritized beyond the sort of timeliness that I mentioned is that there's also the fact that they're very video-intensive websites. And they did a lot heavy demographic research when they were doing this, and it turns out that the target demographic for those shows, which is like women ages like 25 to 34, watch a disproportionate amount of online video. So the idea is that you're targeting an audience who's already going to be watching more content than had you done a different sort of program. So there's a lot of consideration of how long people will watch, even in a sort of a binge-proof medium like TV news.
Can I just add one little tiny comment? And thinking about the language that we use as well, I think just the word binge, which is why I love the media marathon, because you rarely would call watching a bunch of movies in a row binging. You would call that a movie marathon, which I think Deb Jaramillo talks about a little bit, a BU professor here. Like, just that language we use suggests a negative connotation, which I think is part of what you're saying. This, like, it's kind of this looming in the background, like, is it bad? We're using the language that says, yes, it is. So maybe if we change how we talk about it, we might change our perceptions.
Which is in the news studies that it's like such and such percentage of Americans admit to binging. Like people admit to eating dinner. Like, ooh, scandalous.
I wanted to ask a question to Matthew. So I think you said that you did your study with college students, right? So do you think that new ways of using technology like binge watching, say, necessitates studying like younger people first? And did you think about like expanding your study about like genre and viewing in groups to like older people?
Yeah, so there's 2 things at play there. One is, as a grad student with like limited budget, you got to rely on like Persuasion Pizza and partial credit. So, and undergrads it's convenient. So there's that practical aspect. And even like I would have liked to have done a comedy and a drama, but it was already painful enough to sit through, that many. So part of it's practical, but fortunately, for those of us that study emerging media like digital technologies, the young adults, millennials, plurals, whatever the next group is, they're also at the forefront, and they're going to be the next wave of users that hit the workplace. So it's part practical, but it also makes sense for what we're doing. But then there's also complications like when you get into the social aspect, the loneliness kind of dips like in your late 20s, and then again in like later adulthood. But so when you're studying college students emotionally, it's not normal, right? You're surrounded by your peers all the time, nonstop. So I'm sure there's confounding factors with like maybe the introvert, maybe they just want to get away from like people and just chill and watch something for a little while. So it's both. It's good for now, but also obviously like I'd love to expand that and study adults in the workplace. Once they leave, get out like, oh, the real world's weird and scary.
First, I just want to commend all of you. This was a fantastic panel and very insightful talks across the board, and also very diverse, I think, in terms of the goals and objectives of these different studies. One thing that I just kind of wanted to put out there, because a lot of the emphasis so far on binging, as what has been discussed, is in the context of narratives and our engagement with whether it be characters, right? But I wanted to kind of step a little bit away and think about the social context when you are engaging with these shows, but it might not potentially be with characters in the narrative elements of the shows, but perhaps with the people who also enjoy these programs. And so some of my recent work on social TV looks at how even like when the Harry Potter series had ended, right? This was a few years back. People then started binging and rewatching kind of every single movie and reading every narrative because they wanted to stay connected with the fans of these types of narratives. So I'm kind of curious if any of you have thoughts or maybe have explored this terrain where instead of kind of finding, I think, as you mentioned, Lisa, with those who are dealing with health issues, right, that it's not that maybe parasocial encouragement or engagement might be happening at a different level where it might not be with characters, but with other people who have mutual interests too, and that they don't want to let these people go because even if they've never met them, that this level of high social presence, that when you are engaging with the narrative, you're also potentially feeling more connected in these fan communities. And that's perhaps what's driving binging to happen even more, because you don't want to let go, and that you feel, because some of the research findings that I found is that people say, oh, I find these fan communities to be particularly meaningful, and that I'm contacting them and they're there for me. So it's kind of interesting because I'm kind of just putting out there that to what extent we can also associate binging on through a different lens where it's not necessarily focused on the content per se and the narratives, but perhaps on these other communities of people who share these mutual interests along with you. And so I just kind of want to put that out there.
I think you're onto something prominent, and in the Marathoning Book Project, a lot of the interviewees talked about that. So with the Harry Potter example, when the last movie is going to come out, people are marathon reading the books or marathon reading the movies up until that point. And I think I described it as almost like a fandom membership card, like I have done my job. I have fulfilled all of these, not requirements for the fan community, but I've refreshed my memory. I'm ready to fully participate. I'm gonna, come in costume or do what I need to do. And so I think there is a sense of kind of this proper journey through the narrative and doing not what the fan community prescribes, but what's gonna enable you to be a full participant in that community. I think those are great points.
I know there's not a lot of research out there, which is kind of why we're here and this is fun. But I know there's one thing, Journal of Health Psych, where they looked at predictors for binge watching. And it sounds like you're talking about a positive social capital, like I want to watch this to be able to water cooler talk the next day, or to be part kind of social support that way. And this article, I think they had a couple questions that was, as is the case, it was framed negatively. So it was like FOMO, I don't want to be the only one that hasn't seen Breaking Bad, Mad Men, whatever the most binge shows are. But yeah, one of the little bullets I had at the end that I was I think that's something that we watch out of anticipation of what's everyone's breaking point. If one person you gotta go see whatever, Stranger Things, fine. But when 3 or 4 people all right, I'm gonna go watch it, and then now my anticipation's high. does that set us up to enjoy it more or less? Yeah, there's a ton of cool social factors.
Thank you very much. I just have a question for Lisa, because like I'm always wondering if in an in-person interview will people have like positive bias, like they tend to talk about positive side of the story, something like that. So I'm just curious, what are the like possible, like especially when it's come to mental illness or something. So I'm just curious, like what are the negative side? Maybe they described it. Like have they ever described the negative effect of binge, like movie marathon or film marathon?
I do think there's more to it, right? There's the self-presentation bias. There was only one marathoner who really talked about regrets. So she felt depressed and was interested in Game of Thrones because it was such a complicated narrative to follow that it really pulled her out of her own mind. But then afterwards she felt guilty that she couldn't have pushed through her depression and just done her work. So there was kind of a sense of, I'll say, self-loathing after the marathon, but she felt like she needed it at the time. But I think you're absolutely right. There's more to the story if we could just tap into that without thinking about just their kind of conscious explanations for why they did what they did and how good it was, you know, in terms of that health struggle.
I'd just like to add a quick comment and then a question for Josh. So really interesting work for all of the panelists. I mean, I love putting this together and to have all you there on one panel is just amazing for us. So thanks for being here again. And the question I have for Josh is, I know you ran out of time a bit there, and maybe you get to this farther on in the presentation or the book. But I wonder if you've looked at or thought about some of the newer disruptive sort of news agencies. I'm thinking here of Newsy. Perhaps as an app you can get quite easily, or Cheddar, you know, often runs live on Twitter and things like this. I mean, have you considered those sort of disruptive agencies in how they might fit into your model of news and prime time and shifting to online?
Yeah, so I mean, the honest answer is not a ton at this point. So I just kind of like push the last project over the transom. So it's something that I would be really interested in the future. I do know that like you see some variability in terms of just among like the sort of larger institutional news networks, like Bloomberg News, for example, you know, is not rated, and so the amount of worry that they have about, say, like cannibalizing their cable audience or something like that is much lower. And so they've been relatively open with just live streaming everything on the web, which is not something you see with some of the other networks. So I mean, within sort of the traditional institutions that I've thought a little bit more about, you see some variability in terms of what their sort of legacy business interests look like. And so I think, you know, if you want to start, you could probably maybe start plotting some of that stuff on a spectrum where, you know, the freer you are from like sort of traditional forms of monetization, the more like, you know, the more places you're going to be in interesting ways, I guess. Oh, what? I'll say. Sorry. If it's okay, I'll say one other thing, which is, and this is the thing that you were mentioning at the end, which is, you know, what executives told me that there are two basically different points, and I've kind of thought of them now since then as a matrix by putting them together. There are two things that really affect monetization and the business model that you can use for online content, and one of them is timeliness, right? So how soon does something get stale? And so if you're talking about like scripted dramas like Indiana Jones or something like that, you can still make money off of it decades later. But if you're talking about the news, diminishes in quantity, in sort of value every hour, to the point where by tomorrow, there's no point. Although you can monetize your archives in interesting ways. The other aspect though is exclusivity, right? So sports is very timely. But companies that air sports can also have an exclusive contract with the NBA or something like that to air a particular program. There are no exclusive rights to a White House press conference. Is an example that Charlie Tillinghast once shared with me, although that may change in the future. But it's very easy for people to flip between sort of cognate products with respect to news, and so what you tend to see, like if you think about sort of if you think about kind of the archetypes of each of these, like, so I've already named two. If something is timely but not exclusive, that's sort of like archetypically news. If something is timely but very exclusive, that would be maybe sports. Something is not timely but exclusive would be something like the scripted drama Indiana Jones. And then you have like the public domain for stuff that is neither exclusive nor timely. And people always are trying to push their products or their business model into sort of quarter of the matrix that is both timely and exclusive. So for news, that means like branding your news somehow, having a personality that people want to see, having a spin or something like that that's very unique to your, or like a column or something like that that's very unique to your platform. And then even with scripted dramas and things like that, there's always attempts to keep franchises relevant and keep them and make them of the moment. And so I think one of the interesting things is sort of that a business model affects is in terms of we're talking about trying to migrate from a legacy business model, or you're talking about some of these newer apps, is sort of where do you play in that sort of matrix and how much control do you have over those different factors. And so I think that's one interesting way to compare sort of newer and like born digital and legacy media when it comes to that sort of thing.
Thank you very much. I would also like to add my compliments to the panel for the nice job that they did from the multiple perspectives. I would like to address a comment and a question to Josh as well, and I appreciate your preceding summary with your matrix of content judgment. I thought it was a lot of fun for me to see how the mighty and powerful have failed in these enterprises, but I couldn't help but to think, what do we learn from that? Because likewise, who would have thought something like Snapchat would be worth $30 billion? And wouldn't that be foolish to invest your money in something as crazy as that? What about Netscape? What a great idea, just like Google, but before Google's time. It failed, Google wildly successful. What about pay TV? What a crazy idea in the 50s that people would pay for free content. And of course, with HBO and all down the line, fantastic fortunes have been made. So I'm kind of struggling to understand how we can really get lessons about how far ahead of the technological curve you should be in order to be smart and successful versus stupid and a failure.
I think that's a great question, and one of the interesting like sort of aspects of it is that if you're so I think we had sort of like maybe a little bit of a what I think of is there's a lot of brilliant scholarship involved in it, but in some ways counterproductive discussion, especially in journalism studies over the last decade about sort of why don't these big media institutions behave like startups? Why are they so slow to get the internet and that kind of thing? And I think that it overlooked a lot of major investments in this. Like one of the stories I don't tell from the book in there is about how MSNBC.com purchased a social network, and basically made that part of their business model, which it became kind of an also-ran and was repurposed within the company, but like that Newsvine was at one point a really big contender. And so there's an example of a company really trying to take this seriously. And I also think but I also think the discussion about sort of why don't these companies behave like startups glosses over a lot of the really unique challenges that they have, right? Because if all of your money that you're making, is from one business model, you can't immediately flip to the other because you don't you can't cannibalize all of your own resources at once. So you have to turn it like a battleship. And the other thing is with legacy brands have a very different problem than startups do, which is that your problem if you're a startup like one of these apps is that is that nobody knows who you are. And as you grow, you have an opportunity, if you're lucky enough to grow, you have an opportunity to sort of like fashion your service around what your users want to do with it. So Twitter sort of famously incorporated users' innovations of hashtags, which came from IRC and that kind of thing, and they redesigned their platform around sort of the things that users were actually trying. And there's a lot and nobody quite knows what the content is. So MySpace finds that there's a ton of bands on their service, so they make it about music, and that's successful for a while. But if you are CBS, and the minute you open up a comment thread, the minute you sort of open up user participation features and that type of thing, everybody already has an opinion about you, and they think they know who you are, right? You're the people who hired Dan Rather or fired Dan Rather or, or did any of these, a number of things, and they're all just sitting, waiting at the gates, ready to flame you. And so I think that, so there's a lot of interesting challenges when it comes to being sort of a legacy media corporation when it comes to sort of testing the waters in these new environments. And so I think, so I don't have an easy answer, but I think, but I do think that that there, being somebody who thinks a lot about sort of socio-technical systems and all these different factors that come into play, all I can say is that I think it's really complicated, and it's sometimes hard to take lessons from everything. I mean, I can tell you sort of the last sort of portion about adaptation is as online video becomes a thing, and television news anchors are not willing to invest in the web because they're still very much want to do their day job. These companies like MSNBC.com are left with a bunch of video that they have exclusive rights to, and they can put that online, and they can monetize that for the first time, and so they're really excited about that. But they're not getting any other content, so they build sites that look like static video players. And so there's ways in which these institutions co-evolve and so forth that are that become they get really complicated. And the last part of the story is also sort of bootlegging and piracy. If you don't put your clips up very quickly, everybody links to a clip of Keith Olbermann on YouTube. So they're forced to adapt, but at the same time they can't switch over very easily.
If I may, I'll make a very quick response. I think actually most large corporations would be very unhappy if they acted like a startup, because most startups fail. So we're very selective. We only see a very small percentage, less than 1%, become successful. So but we think, oh, those are successful. We don't look at how many started out and failed. So just a comment there about the pseudo-attractiveness of startups. Thank you.
I love it.